Hi there, my name is Brian Ward, and I want to welcome you to our 17th episode of the ARKHAM Sessions. This is the podcast that psychoanalyzes every episode of Batman the Animated Series, and you can't have proper psychoanalysis without a proper psychologist, so joining me as always is my co-host, Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
Hi there.
Hey there. It's a pretty big week for us. In addition to this fine podcast, you and I, either independently or together, have made a couple of appearances over at other podcasts, including Legends of the Dark Knight, where we spent a bit chatting with Mike and Steve about our show, as well as some other cool stuff. And that was fun.
Yeah.
Highly recommend finding them over at geekcastradio.com. And again, the name of the show is Legends of the Dark Knight. It's a fun show. You should check it out. And then you did a couple by yourself.
That's right. This week I had the pleasure of chatting with Henry over at the Geek Speak show. He was doing a WonderCon kind of pre-show, so we talked a little bit about the panels coming up for WonderCon. And you can find his podcast over at thegeekspeakshow.com.
Cool.
The other podcast I was on is a Star Wars-centric podcast by Trisha Barr and her co-host Teresa. And
guys, let me tell you, in addition to Batman, if Drea knows anything, it's Star Wars. So any podcast she's on about Star Wars, check this out.
It was actually a lot of fun because we got to talk about Batman and Vader, which are sort of like my two favorite characters.
How is that podcast not still going? How did they get you
how
off
am I
the radio?
Here? Yeah. I know. I was also attacked by a cat during the recording of that show, and they edited that out, but that was it was a little bit traumatic.
Bloopers.
Yeah. So their podcast is called Fangirls Going Rogue, and they can be found on shotglassdigital.com.
Awesome. Shotglassdigital. Vodka o'clock, shotglassdigital.com. Drea, I'm sensing a theme with you. You guest star on a lot of...
Those are just coincidental appearances. But you know what's later this week.
Yes, I do. WonderCon. So we'll be going down to Anaheim late in the week, and then we've got a couple of panels there.
We do. So, of course, our panel together is the Psychology of Star Trek versus Star Wars. That is Saturday evening from 7:30 to 8:30. And
Room 213, I think.
That's a good memory.
Yeah. I tweeted about it.
We are joined by my good friend, colleague, and fellow psychologist, Dr. Ellie Matu. And our guest panelists are Chase Masterson and Kat Tabor. And
you would know Chase Masterson as Lita from Deep Space Nine, and then Kat Tabor is the voice of Amidala of Padme from Star Wars: The Clone Wars. So it's going to be a lot of fun going into sort of the psychological depths of these franchises with these two folks.
And for more Bat-centric fans, there is a Batgirl panel that I'm on called Batgirl Begins Again, and I will be on that panel with Gail Simone, and Dr. Travis Langley is moderating the panel, and we'll talk about the psychology of this current iteration of Barbara Gordon, aka Batgirl, and her experiences going to therapy, receiving mental health treatment, and struggling with some post-traumatic stress sort of responses from some previous physical and psychological trauma.
And when is that panel?
That panel is Sunday at 1:30.
Sunday at 1:30, and then you've got a third panel.
I do. So early Saturday at 10:30 is a panel called The Battle for Multicultural Heroes, and I'll be on that panel talking about the need for more multiculturalism and diversity in the comic book genre.
It sounds like it's going to be a pretty great weekend.
It'll be a lot of fun.
So if you're planning on heading down to Anaheim, which I certainly encourage you to do, check out Drea's panel schedule over at underthemaskonline.com, and please say hi. We'd love to meet you guys. Also, on a pretty cool note, I'm not sure if folks have seen this yet, but if you haven't, you need to check out Bruce Timm's new short film, Strange Days. That celebrates Batman's 75th anniversary. It's loosely done in the style of Batman the Animated Series, but with a flair of Batman's original appearance and sort of the serial noir feel, and it revolves around Batman's attempt to rescue a woman who's been kidnapped by Hugo Strange, who is one of Batman's original supervillains, and Solomon Grundy, and it's just shy of 3 minutes, well worth it. It's Bruce Timm's first time writing, directing, animating a Batman story in a while. So DC Entertainment put it up on YouTube. Definitely worth it. Go check it out.
For people that really liked Batman the Animated Series, I felt like this had that classic tone to it.
Yeah.
And like you said, then you had sort of the Batman version that looks a little different.
Yeah, the Bob Kane.
Yeah. So, and there's not a lot of dialogue. I know it's a short, but there isn't a ton of dialogue. Most of it is visual. Most of it is action. So it's kind of cool.
Definitely adds to the creepy vibe they're going for. The sort of noirish feel. The sepia tone that they're using is pretty great. Otherwise, it's black and white. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I really liked it a lot. So definitely check that out. And then I'm excited to get into this week's episode of the podcast because we're getting back into the real psychological meat. We've had a couple of dud weeks in that the Cat in the Claw.
Well, I wouldn't say Catwoman is a dud topic.
I did not say she was a dud, but in terms of, regardless of how good those two episodes were, because they were good episodes, not the highest in sort of psychological value. Although we did get a pretty nice look into Bruce's infatuation with Selena Kyle, and then his heartbreak once he learned that she was totally in love with the Bat.
No.
So that was nice. Mm-hmm. This week, I think, is going to be much stronger in terms of the depth that we can get into. This week, we're taking a look at Ceno Evil, which was written by Martin Pasco and directed by Dan Reba. This one aired on February 24th, 1993. We start out at night. Shocker. It's Batman, so, we're working at night. It's sort of like I've always said, Drea, if you want to beat the Batman, you pull all of your crimes during the day. Done. Anyway, this one starts out at night. We see a bit of troubling interaction between a small girl named Kimmy and her invisible friend Mojo.
Mojo, you came back!
And this is a legit invisible friend, not just imaginary. We've seen Mojo lift Kimmy's window, and we've seen... we've heard Mojo give her jewelry, albeit not the jewelry she wants.
Now don't worry, I know that what you've really been hoping for is a pearl necklace.
What a girl that age really wants a pearl necklace for?
I don't know, but Mojo really wants to give one to her.
Mojo really wants to give her a pearl necklace.
It's one of his big promises.
It is.
Mojo promises he'll bring you one next time he visits.
Okay, I distinctly remember being a child. And I was an incredibly imaginative child, and I spent most of my childhood without many friends.
That doesn't surprise me.
Nor should it. But I, one, never had an imaginary friend, and B, would have flipped out if a disembodied voice, particularly one named Mojo, came into my room and brought me stuff.
And promised you a pearl necklace?
Yes. But little Kimmy doesn't. She doesn't flip out. She's totally okay with this. Drea, what is wrong with this girl?
There's nothing wrong with Kimmy. I think that they don't say explicitly how old little Kimmy is, but we're gathering that she's probably like, what?
6, 7?
Yeah, 6 or 7 years old.
Yeah.
So certainly at that age, having an imaginary friend is not abnormal, or pathological or anything. And usually the children that have imaginary friends, aren't actually seeing, they're not hallucinating. They aren't actually seeing imaginary people. And they acknowledge at least in their own developmental way, that is a construct of their imagination.
Right. This is not a construct. This is something that is physically in her room, and she is not terrified over it.
And it's my understanding that her mother, Helen, believes that she's kind of playing and that she has this imaginary friend. And that's why Helen really isn't bothered by these stories of Mojo coming into her bedroom at night and playing with her and giving her gifts.
Expensive jewelry.
Right. On the other hand, Kimmy, I think she understands this is not her imagination. This is this fantastical, different, unique friend that she has that comes into her room, and there's no fear there. She's not frightened by Mojo at all. And I think part of that is, the big reveal is that Mojo is actually related to her.
Right.
So
she doesn't know him. Like, she doesn't, we'll get into that, but But yeah, I think I would worry about Kimmy on a little bit of a deeper level as she gets older, because she's still at the age of 6 or 7, at an age where she should know that there aren't invisible people.
Right.
She's a little too trusting. She's a little too friendly with invisible things that hand her jewels. So, yeah.
I might even say, we don't, as we get to know her throughout the episode, she does have age-appropriate judgment later on.
Yeah.
But we don't know that she isn't, let's say, struggling with any kind of developmental delay.
Right.
We don't know if she has emotional or psychological conditions, or if she has a learning disorder or anything like that. So it is possible that's in some way developmentally she's a little bit different than most kids her age. So there we have maybe potentially, of course, a developmental concern. The other concern or factor is that, of course, she lives in a single parent household. It's just Kimmy and her mother. As the story unfolds, we realize her father has been in prison during most of Kimmy's life.
So having this invisible male character sort of giving her gifts is maybe the imaginary / invisible father that she doesn't know.
Sure. Yeah, I could see that.
So let's talk about that. Kimmy tells Mojo that her mom has told her that they're going to move.
Next time better be soon, or you might not find us.
Which seems to upset Mojo a little bit. He takes off and we cut to what appears to be a jewelry show. Bruce Wayne is taking a look at an expensive watch, and while this is going on, we're introduced to Lloyd Ventrix, who steps inside the men's room, locks the door, which is apparently a crime.
Hey, who locked the bathroom?
And is putting on an invisibility suit. He walks out of the bathroom and then just starts robbing the place. I mean, kind of recklessly, just like ripping jewelry out of people's hands. And...
Yeah, he's not subtle, because I feel like if he would just kind of slip through and
that leads me. Yeah, if you had, Drea, an invisibility suit and you had the opportunity to steal a bunch of jewelry, how would you do it in this situation?
Well, first of all, you don't know that I don't have an invisibility suit.
I don't.
But let's say if I had one, I probably would not be so obvious with my jewelry stealing. Because, you just don't want to get caught.
Yeah.
And you don't want other people. I mean, as this is unfolding, people are realizing that there is this thing that's taking the jewelry and knocking people over and causing this mess. So, again, I don't know why, if you're going to continue to I don't know if that's your strategy. If you're going to continue to rob various, shows and jewelry shops and everything.
You wouldn't be ripping things out of their hands. Like, I agree with you 100%. I would do it exactly the way that I would do it if I didn't have the invisibility suit. I'd still sneak stuff so that people wouldn't even notice it was missing. And then, they wouldn't have seen me. They wouldn't know I was ever in the room. And they certainly wouldn't know that anything weird was happening. And then, I'd just walk out the door. But Ventrix, had he done any of that, he wouldn't have caught the attention of Bruce Wayne and, of course, Batman. Ventrix isn't that smart, though. And he does get the attention of the Bat. And Batman chases him outside into the construction area.
Oh, no.
Yeah. This is one of those areas where there's a little bit of an animation. You could say it's an animation mistake. They left the second C out of construction. Or you could just say that within the world of Gotham, someone who maybe didn't know how to spell construction made that sign.
I like that.
It's the construction area.
Yeah.
Or it's under construction. Batman chases him outside and Ventrix kicks his butt solely because he has the advantage of invisibility. Now, I'm sorry, but this is kind of where Marty Pasco loses me a little. There is no way that Batman would lose in a fight to someone like, say, Jean-Claude Van Damme. But in every JCVD movie, we see him blinded, and then he's fighting people blindly because he can feel them and hear them, etc. But Batman apparently needs to see his assailant. I don't buy it. Regardless, Batman loses his fight with Ventrix and ruins freshly poured cement in the process. Mm-hmm. It's just unfortunate.
Well, this is one of those episodes, like many before, where, Batman is fallible. He's not perfect. He's not always in great shape.
And there's always someone there to witness it. There's a poor guy eating his lunch, and he sees Batman fall into the cement.
Yeah, I like that. I like that he's sometimes humiliated. He falls. He loses consciousness. He gets knocked out.
And it's always some working class guy, like a janitor wakes him up, a construction guy who's just poured cement watches him get his butt beat. Like it's never like a high end, social maven. It's always some construction worker or whatever hanging out watching.
Well, and I'd like to think that only some people actually see Batman.
Right.
Like some, maybe folks that never see him think that he's this mythical thing, and he's, the stories of him are much greater than the reality of Batman. And so it's only these folks that work during the night or folks that are in the streets that really see the true Batman.
I just figured out what this episode really is. This episode all happened within the imagination of the construction worker.
You stole what I was going to say. I was going to say at the end of this is all just one big, wish fulfillment.
For whom?
Kimmy.
Oh, it's always a kid.
I know.
It's always a kid with you. Like the kids like to imagine. No,
yeah, but I don't
for
know
me, it's all about the construction worker. He was like, hey, you know what happened? I was sitting outside. I just poured cement and I was eating my sandwich. And suddenly I watched Batman get the crap kicked out of him by an invisible man. Like that's sort of what I think. It's the wish fulfillment of the construction worker.
The construction worker.
Yeah.
It's his wish.
By this point, we pretty much know that Kimmy's father is Ventrix, and he's the one in the suit. But just in case you weren't sure, he says,
she's never gonna take you away from me.
He follows her mother to work at the grocery store, and we learn that Ventrix is on parole, and that he has a restraining order against him, and that he has to stay a minimum of 100 feet away from his ex-wife and daughter. Now, naturally, he claims that everything's different, but, she makes her wish very clear.
All I want is for you to disappear.
Now, we have a lot to look at here. A, Ventrix is an ex-con.
Yeah.
B, he's on parole, so he's clearly shown signs of rehabilitation and remorse to somebody. And C, we have his wife, who's clearly unhappy that her ex-husband is back, and she has successfully gotten a restraining order against him. But not only that, she's also preparing to move Kimmy and herself out of town, presumably because he's around. Mm-hmm. Let's first talk about Ventrix, the life of a convict.
Because I know that so well.
You know that so well. But you have dealt with folks who are, sort of in this position.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is I have worked with individuals who have been incarcerated, who certainly have been in the legal system, who have broken the law, and certainly who are undergoing rehabilitation or have undergone rehabilitation. But we certainly know that Helen has a restraining order against him.
Right.
And usually restraining orders surround the idea of protection and safety. That if you're near that person, that perpetrator, you're in harm's way or your children are in harm's way. There is a potential threat there.
Yeah.
Either domestic violence, either the nature of his criminality was such that, he could not be near his family following his incarceration. There's something there. And I think the message to us is he's an unsafe person.
Let's talk about her. Let's talk about Helen, the spouse of an incarcerated. By the way, we want to make it very clear that we're not suggesting that every incarcerated person, is going to go on parole, is going to get paroled and then, kidnap his daughter. But,
right.
This is a unique case for sure. But let's talk about Helen a little bit, being the wife or ex-wife of an ex-con. He's clearly been in prison for a while because Kimmy doesn't seem to know him.
Right.
And she has done everything she can to prevent her from ever getting to know him. So talk about what she's going through.
Well, I think we actually see some pretty healthy functioning from Helen's end and Kimmy's end, which we talked about a little bit. We see that Helen is employed. We see that Kimmy is in school. We see that they have a home, that they're ostensibly financially stable, at least within the limitations of the episode.
Right.
We don't see substance abuse. We don't see, mental health struggles. We don't see financial struggles. These are kinds of things that we would look for when we wonder, what is the impact of having this this parent separated or incarcerated and leaving this family, on their own. So the breakup of the family, or, the original family, hasn't, at least from what we see, impacted Helen and Kimmy to a great extent.
Right.
We talked about Kimmy a little bit in the sense that, sure, she believes that this invisible person is real. But other than that, we aren't seeing what we might be worried about in terms of having or experiencing parental loss, or a parent being incarcerated, or any similar type of trauma. So
let's talk about that. What would you be afraid of? Like what would be telltale signs of a problem?
Well,
when it comes to a child.
Yeah, well, something you would look for is mood problems like depression, isolation, feeling helpless or hopeless. If they're a little bit older, children and youths feeling like suicidal or experiencing thoughts of wanting to harm themselves. Other things we might see would be like having nightmares or intrusive thoughts about this family breakup or the loss of a parent. We would see academic problems, so being distracted at school, feeling too anxious or too depressed to function at school. We would see interpersonal problems, so difficulty making friends, not having close relationships, and not having a healthy relationship with a remaining parent. But what we see with Kimmy and Helen is that they do have a healthy relationship. She's quite trusting of her mother, and her mother is quite nurturing, and she's an incredible mom. So, I mean, just to answer your question, I don't really see any kind of sign or symptom of either Helen or Kimmy hinting that the dad being incarcerated has caused a huge problem for them.
So from here, Batman has had his butt handed to him by an invisible man. So clearly he goes over to Wayne Tech. And Bruce learns that a former Invisibility project was introduced, but was pulled out before any real work could be done on it.
The Cloak of Invisibility, he called it, right?
And Bruce learns that the project creator is dead, but that his assistant's still around and keeping up the work. So Batman tracks down the assistant and learns... Basically, we learn that he's not the thief. He's not the man in the invisible suit. But he does learn about the plastic, and he learns about how it works, particularly the fact that the interactions between the electricity and the filament inside are what make it bend light. And the reaction that takes place becomes poisonous, affecting the mind and the body. And he also learns that Ventrix was a hired employee on the project, kind of an intern and an assistant of sorts. And that there's a bit of the plastic which was set for destruction missing. So we now know.
I kind of think I know where that plastic is.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Mojo finally brings Kimmy that pearl necklace she's always wanted.
Oh, Mojo, it's exactly what I wanted.
And he takes her from her home and takes her to the Galaxy Drive-In movie theater, where he has a car waiting. Now, by this point, everything is creepy. Kimmy is walking around in her little nightgown, her right arm raised above her head as she's being led by an invisible man. Frankly, it's creepier than Carol Ann and Poltergeist. But this is also where Kimmy sort of turns a corner and wisens up a little bit. She's not down with getting into Mojo's car.
You want me to get in your car?
And when Mojo reveals that he's actually her father, she's not really all that down with that either.
Right.
I'm your daddy.
My daddy? Get away!
Batman steps in, and Kimmy gets away, and the rest of the episode is essentially a surreal chase with Batman on the roof of Ventrix's now invisible car, which reminds me of all the animation mistakes I've ever seen. Because we see Batman basically looking like he's flying.
I didn't know he could fly, too.
We know there's a car under him, but we don't see it. So, if you're like me and you've seen a lot of animation mistakes, you're just sort of like, oh, animator forgot the car. But it's really kind of heady. Kimmy returns to her mother. Batman fights Ventrix and is still on the losing end until he's able to see Ventrix through a water tower raining down on him.
Peekaboo.
Peekaboo.
At the end of the episode, Kimmy's mother asks who Kimmy's speaking with at her window, and typically Kimmy would have responded Mojo, but in this case she says,
Just Batman, Mommy.
Oh, him again.
her mother is under the impression that Kimmy's made up a new imaginary friend, but frankly, I'm not entirely sure why. She's encountered the Batman by this point, Helen. Has encountered the Batman at this point.
He actually, earlier in the episode, confronts her about Mojo being the, her ex-husband and potentially a threat to Kimmy.
Right.
And so, but I actually interpreted her kind of humor at the end of that episode as saying, she acknowledges that it probably is Batman.
I don't know. No, I think she kind of comes over and closes the window, and she's just sort of like, time for bed. And then, of course, we tilt up and we see that Batman is in fact perched outside the house, checking in on little Kimmy.
Yeah.
Now, one really cool thing about this particular episode, full of guest stars, or would-be guest stars. Michael Gross is playing Lloyd Ventrix. Children of the 80s would certainly remember him as the father of Alex P. Keaton on Family Ties. Ken Howard, star of The White Shadow, is Harkness. Brock Peters, who some would know as the man on trial in To Kill a Mockingbird, and others would know as Admiral Cartwright from the Star Trek films, plays Lucius Fox in his first appearance on the series. And Jean Smart from Designing Women is playing Kimmy's mother, Helen. Kimmy herself is played by Elizabeth Moss, who would later ditch the Z for an S and go on to play President Bartlett's daughter Zoe in The West Wing, and now stars as Peggy Olson in Mad Men.
Wow.
Yeah, so this one is full of people who were pretty big names at the time, and then others who would later become pretty big names. So it's kind of interesting. We've talked about child innocence. We've talked about adults who are incarcerated or have spouses or partners who are incarcerated. We've talked about what that could potentially do to a child. Now let's talk about invisibility. This is all speculative, of course, but one thing that always comes to mind when someone brings this up is how H.G. Wells dealt with his character Griffin in his serial novel, The Invisible Man. And how Alan Moore turned that character into even more of a madman in the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. But, really these are all modern tales of Plato's Ring of Gyges, which was a mystical ring in Plato's Republic that allowed its wearer to become invisible.
Just like the ring in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, that ring did turn you invisible. The Ring of Gyges does something a little more... basically, Plato was a philosopher. So, the story wasn't just entertaining fiction. His notion was that anonymity, the invisibility, would corrupt an otherwise moral man. Mm-hmm. So in the way that the One Ring... in The Lord of the Rings corrupts Frodo or Bilbo, mentally, it's sort of the ring is doing that.
Right.
In Plato's vision, it was that this guarantee of not being seen and thus not being caught or punished would cause this person to do horrible things. It's not so much that the ring is what's corroding the wearer's morality. It's serving more to the point that morality itself is sort of a human construct. Now, we've talked a little bit about how masks open up possibilities for their wearers in previous episodes. Is this invisibility clause, for lack of a better word, an extension of that same concept? Does anonymity corrupt?
Yeah, well, philosophers were on the right track because later social psychologists did some pretty groundbreaking research to find that anonymity did impact inhibitions in the sense that it lowered them, of course. And people do behave in different ways, maybe in more subversive ways, in uninhibited ways, if they were not in that anonymous place, would not do so.
Gotcha.
One of the reasons is this thing called Deindividuation.
Oh.
So this is the concept of basically losing your self-awareness and not being able to be identified. So it's wearing a mask or a costume or physically being cloaked by invisibility, if you will. Deindividuation can happen in a couple of ways. One is in crowds of people. So I know you've heard of, in big crowds, people sort of act in different ways because they can't get caught or you can't really tell who did what. The other way that's
sort of rioting, that kind of rioting or the, lynch mob mentality or rioting.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Takes away that accountability.
Right.
The other way that one can experience de-individuation is through physical masking. So whether it's wearing an actual mask or costume or this, more fictional idea of the invisibility cloak. And the studies, interestingly, that look at de-individuation in terms of altering the physical aspects of an individual are more hypothetical, but they indeed do show that people would choose more subversive, rule-breaking, kind of antisocial behavior than, if they weren't in that more anonymous position.
Right.
We also know this from the internet that... Why'd you make that?
What? The internet?
This thing called the internet that has just erased the possibility of acting in ways, behaving in ways without being seen, without being identified. And that has certainly lowered inhibitions and caused more kind of rule-breaking antisocial behavior in terms of that whole troll aspect.
Right. The worst possible thing the internet ever did was allow people to go by handles and avatars, no names associated with it.
Right. So this interactive classroom exercise that professors and some social psychologists have kind of played around with is called Robbers in the Classroom. And what they do is they ask the question to participants of their study or to the class, if you could do anything humanly possible with complete assurance that you would not be detected or held responsible, what would you do?
Okay.
So Brian, what would you say?
I do not know.
Nothing you can say on the air, I guess.
Well, nothing that, I've never really had a desire to like steal things. Like I've never had that impulse. There are things I want. There are things certainly that I covet, but I've never like, oh, if I could steal that. And I wouldn't do anything physically, violent or anything. Like I'm not that kind of. I don't know. It's something that I would think about.
Yeah. Well, in this classic exercise, students are asked to actually turn in their answers, anonymously without identifying themselves. And then what this researcher Dodd found is that there are 11 kind of different categories of content that people responded to for this question. Aggression, charity, academic dishonesty. What would be academic dishonesty? Like cheating on tests and so forth.
Right.
Crime, escapism, political activities, sexual behavior, social disruption, interpersonal spying, and eavesdropping.
Now it's interesting because you started that list out with like charity. So certain people would choose good things to do with their anonymity.
Yes.
Oh, because my mind immediately goes to the negative. Like
me too.
What would you get away with?
Me too. which we'll get at in a second.
I would probably go with the interpersonal eavesdropping, and like I'm a people watcher. So if I could do that without anyone actually seeing that I'm a people watcher, like I go out to the mall and I enjoy like just sort of observing people.
Yeah. So last week when I was attacked by a bird, you would have wanted me to be sitting there.
I would have watched that.
Yeah. The other ones are traveling and this sort of other category, which, the catch-all
Traveling.
category.
That's like you're too lazy to get a passport, so you sneak onto an airplane. Like, why would you not need to be seen or known if you're traveling?
Answers were also categorized as pro-social, antisocial, and something called non-normative. Non-normative isn't necessarily good or bad. It's just violating social norms, without necessarily helping or hurting someone else. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And finally, a neutral category. Like, it doesn't seem to fit any of those other previous categories. So the most frequent response...
Those are the people you worry about. It's the people who don't fit into any category that you're like, oh, gotta watch out for their answers.
The most frequent responses were criminal acts at 26%.
Sure.
Sexual acts at 11%. And spying behaviors at 11%. And the most common single response was to rob a bank.
So people... Okay, I'm fascinated by this, and now you've totally got me on a tangent. Okay, so... Or the percentage of people who would just rather watch is the same percentage of people who would commit sexual acts.
Right. And that's a broad category, sexual acts. There's no assumption there that those are, I don't know.
What else could you do? If the point of the exercise is not being known or caught, then there's some sort of, I guess, quote unquote, deviance there, right? But then robbing a bank is the number one answer.
Yep, that's the top answer. And in fact, the results revealed that 36% of the responses were antisocial, compared to 19% non-normative, 9% pro-social, and then 36% just neutral, didn't really fall into that.
And I'm guessing of all the people who chose to rob a bank, they would probably choose to do it quietly and secretively, not running
not
in,
flailing about
grabbing bags of money
Right.
out of people's hands.
Right. But what David Dodd essentially found is that more than a third of the participants would participate in what's considered like antisocial behavior.
So what you're saying is the de-individuation doesn't always bring out the negative or antisocial just a lot of the time, a third of the time.
Right. It may influence or facilitate that kind of behavior because, as we talked about, there's no consequences or repercussions. On the other hand, there is some research to show that that de-individuation doesn't lead to aggressive or hostile or rule-breaking behavior. For instance, another researcher showed that by ushering a bunch of participants into a dark chamber or room with very little light, and telling them you will be left in the room for no more than an hour with some other people, and there are no rules as to what you should do, together. They're told at the end you will leave the room alone and you'll never meet the other participants. So you and 7 strangers of both sexes spend the next hour together.
True story.
True story.
Yeah.
And so what do you think would happen?
Make out session. be like 7 minutes in heaven.
Not really.
Oh.
In the original experiment, participants who spent an hour in a dark room ended up talking very little, but the majority of them intentionally touched someone and half-hugged another. Very few...
Half-hug?
Sorry.
Look, it's dark in here. We're only going to half-hug.
Sorry. 90% intentionally touched someone and 50% hugged another. Very few participants disliked the experience. In fact, most volunteered to return without pay. So what that study showed is that the anonymity actually increased intimacy and closeness, but not in that kind of like antisocial, aggressive,
And they didn't
subversive way.
They didn't really talk about it either. Like you said that most of them sort of kept quiet. Not a whole lot going on.
Yeah, they actually did the study with participants in a lighted room and found that there was more conversation in that room. But in the dark room, while there was minimal conversation, the conversation dealt with more important things. So not small talk, but like more personal things. And like I said, there was more intimacy, touching and hugging.
If you were in the dark for an hour with complete strangers, like, what would be the first thing you said?
I'd probably say, "Hey, we're going to be here for a while, so let's talk about some boundaries and limitations, and then let's make the most of it." And I don't know.
How can you make the most of it if you're in a room that no one can tell who you are or what you're doing, or you just told them they can't make the most of it.
I think it's one of those things where you end up, like, people's personalities end up being, very
hyper.
Like, I think it heightens the other aspects that are not physical.
Right.
And so people's personalities.
You're such a clinical psychologist.
Oh, jeez. If anyone's interested in reading more about some of these studies on anonymity and de-individuation, one of the articles is actually called Deviance in the Dark by Psychology Today. The other one, the previous one I mentioned, is called Robbers in the Classroom, a De-Individuation Exercise in Teaching of Psychology. And that's an older paper back in 1985.
Oh, what did they know? What did they know?
They knew a lot.
It's the 21st century now. You think those numbers would have gone up or down? Do you think they'd stay the same 20 years later?
That people would still rob?
Yeah, 30 years later. Do you think that it's still just a third of people would do negative things? Or, like, do you think the fact that it's 2014 right now would change those numbers? It's interesting.
I don't know, but I think robbing a bank, to me, while it's rule breaking and illegal, it also, I don't see that as necessarily being too harmful, because the people that chose that, if you think this through, wanted to gain access to resources, money, and do better for themselves. So it's sort of like, if I could do something that it would put me in a better situation but wouldn't necessarily harm anyone else, it would be to rob a bank.
So what you're saying is, in cases, it can be problematic to give someone anonymity, to give someone invisibility.
It can be, yeah.
This worries me a little bit because I'll tell you why. I like to talk a little bit about real life when discussing these episodes, and it turns out that we're not terribly far from something that could render its wearer invisible. This is something that governments all over the world have been researching and funding and working on for decades, mind you. But in the 90s and the early 2000s, one suit was still experimental, but it was sort of making the rounds on science television shows, and I remember seeing it. It was basically using fiber optic cameras on one side of the suit that projected onto the other side. So if you were looking at someone's front, it would appear as if you were looking straight through them, because the front would have a projection of what the cameras on the wearer's back were shooting.
As they moved around, that would correspond.
It would, yeah, exactly. It would look weird, but it would, that was the sort of theory that they were putting out on these shows. But this idea of bending light, though, it's something that really isn't so far away. Just in the last few years, both Duke University and the University of Central Florida have each announced that they've independently created prototypes for stuff like this. In the case of the University of Central Florida, they've created a material by basically printing this fine silver and composite fishnet-like mesh onto a flexible material. And this sort of layered grid pattern, combined with the material that the grid is made of, allows the control of visible spectrum light. So what we can see So by controlling, how the light is spread across the material. The impressive thing is that they've managed to print this stuff onto a 4 square centimeter piece of fabric. So it's still small scale, but considerably larger than it's ever been before, which is both fascinating and a little scary if you think about the kind of person who would eventually be wearing this suit. Mm-hmm. So if Plato is correct, and that even the most moral of people can be corrupted by invisibility, I don't know who I would trust to get into a uniform or a plane or anything else that could be rendered invisible. So I don't know. So
Well, and to tie it back to the episode and kind of look at the motivation of Ventrix, he wasn't necessarily engaging in hostile, violent, aggressive behavior. He was actually stealing the jewelry in order to provide for his daughter, and eventually, yes, he kidnapped his daughter.
Yes.
But I think he would have done that without the invisibility.
Yeah, what's interesting is the idea that the plastic was poisoning his mind and his body. I don't know that Ventrix was really affected by the poisoning of his mind so much. I think we were pretty much seeing the man as he probably would have been without the invisibility.
Right, I agree. He didn't seem to be bothered by the idea that this plastic could poison him.
Yeah, he even said he didn't care.
Yeah, he just wanted to be reunited with his daughter.
Right.
And so, I'm not saying that behavior is acceptable, but I'm saying that from the psychological standpoint, you can understand that what his wishes are is to have that close relationship with her.
Right.
And so he goes around it in a very, unfortunately, in a bad way.
Yeah. So, Drea, any final thoughts on Ceno Evil?
I think I like the part at the end where Batman is looking over little Kimmy, and I think that, I don't know, it's kind of a cool message. We know that Kimmy and Helen are going to be just fine. It really kind of, I don't know, it gives this acceptance toward single parent households and the idea that they can be perfectly healthy and safe. And
that's another question that I sort of,
yeah.
In 17 episodes, we've seen at least 2 children of single parent households.
Yeah. I like that it ends in the way that, Kimmy, they don't rehabilitate him, and the dad doesn't reunite with him. They're not reunited with another male figure.
Right.
They're just fine as they are. And on top of that, Batman is connecting with Kimmy somewhat in the idea that maybe he's checking in on her.
Right.
And
or at least letting her know that he will be watching, that he'll be protecting. I don't think that she's necessarily going to be his buddy, but I think he's assuring her, letting her know that he'll be around.
And I kind of like, he's not playing daddy.
Right.
But he's kind of for a moment embracing this parental role, just to a small degree. And I like that because, I don't know, a lot of times we see him as someone who's not connecting with other people, especially children. Mm-hmm. And now this is, I want to say, at least the 3rd time we've seen him connect with a child and be in that real protective role. And of course, I'm going to say that stems from his...
What were the other times?
The orphans.
Right. He didn't really connect.
He
put Frog into Alfred's hands, and then he watched from a distance. And then you've got in my basement, but he was unconscious the entire episode.
We see then a stronger representation of him connecting to a child in that protective way.
Right.
Not as if to say, like, I'm the daddy role now, but to show that he does demonstrate that ability to nurture and have compassion for a child. Mm-hmm. And, I'm going to say this, that it stems from his own childhood experiences, and that when he, of course, was around Kimmy's age, he experienced a life-changing, a life-altering trauma. Mm-hmm. And how do you think he felt at that time? Left alone there with his parents taken away from him.
Sad. He was sad. And alone. And he had an invisible friend named Mojo.
He was helpless.
I was getting to that.
Yes. He was helpless. And as we know, the story has been told many times, he is alone he's left alone when that happens to his parents.
He wasn't that helpless. He had Alfred. He had
helpless.
He had a manservant.
Right, but he was helpless in that moment. And I think that when he is looking after children as Batman, he understands that feeling of helplessness.
Gotcha.
And so, they didn't have to have that last scene there with him there, but I do like that they did that. And I think that it gives us more understanding of his complexity as Batman.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's it for this week. Tune in next week for another pretty cool episode. Beware the Gray Ghost. Until then, you should come find us on Twitter. We are at ARKHAM Sessions.
At Arkham Asylum Doc.
And at BWard028. You should come like us on Facebook. And if you have any questions, comments, criticism, or praise, you can always email us at arkhamsessions@gmail.com or email Drea over at her website, underthemaskonline.com.
If you're at WonderCon this weekend, please stop by and say hello.
Yep, you can find that schedule over at underthemaskonline.com. Until next week, I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
And we are
the ARKHAM Sessions.